Hey everybody, Susan Thomas here, and today I want to teach you all about the different gauges of wire and what you do with them. So I've been making jewelry for a long time, and one of the things that I've found that confuses people a lot is the different gauges that the wires that you use to make jewelry come in. And one of the things that's the most confusing is the higher the number, the thinner the wire. If I'd been doing the whole wire thing, I obviously would have started with the lower gauge and made it smaller, and the higher gauge and made it bigger, but it's completely opposite. So when you're living in wire land, you need to always think that it's the opposite. 28 gauge, the thin stuff, is smaller than 18 gauge, the big stuff. So I'm gonna start down here, actually with 16 gauge, and I'm gonna go through each gauge and talk to you about the diameter of it, and then I'm also going to talk to you about what you might use that particular diameter for. So first of all, this is 16 gauge wire here on the end. It's the heaviest wire that I'm going to talk about today in the continuum of wire. And 16 gauge is about 1.3 millimeters thick. And you might not think that seems really thick, but it really is. You can do a lot of great things with 16 gauge wire. You can even make ring shanks with 16 gauge wire. It's heavy enough to do that. But this is a plated wire that we're working with today. So what I might use this for is to make something like a clasp and an extender chain. So see what I've done here is I've made kind of a J-hook clasp. See how that looks kind of like a J right there? And that I've made 3 links or jump rings to finish off a necklace or bracelet with. So that's just a really great thing to use 16 gauge for. It is heavy enough to do that, so I don't have to worry about this losing its shape because it's really a heavy wire at 1.3 millimeters. Now, if you kind of step down from the 16 gauge and go to the 18 gauge here, this is about 1 millimeter thick. And there's lots of great things you can do with 18 gauge that you could not do with 16 gauge because it was a little bit too heavy. I like to make crazy connectors, crazy open connectors with 18 gauge, like this one. This is fun for links on necklaces. It's also great for making earrings. They're so adorable. But the wire is still heavy enough that you can see it's gonna hold its shape. See, I'm pulling on it like that, even though the connector is still open. I also love 18 gauge for making hoop earrings. So this is a little drop shape right here, and I love to use 18 gauge for that. Heavy enough to hold its shape, even in that large open space right there, but not too heavy so that it looks kind of bulky. I love 18 gauge wire for that. So that's 2 things you can do with 18 gauge wire. Now, step it down again to 20 gauge wire. My favorite thing to do with 20 gauge wire is make ear wires. And I have a pair here that I've made that you can see. I don't use 18 gauge for ear wires because it's a little bit too thick to put through the holes in most people's ears. So you need 20 gauge, and I don't use 22 gauge for ear wires because it's a little too thin to hold its shape. So 20 gauge is perfect. And that's what I like to do with it. Most often, there's lots of other things you can do with 20 gauge. You can make open connectors, you can make hoops, loops, coils, all kinds of things, but that's kind of a great idea of what it's best for. Now step it down again. Let's go to 22 gauge. So remember, now we're about 4 steps thinner than our 16 gauge, and our 22 gauge is gonna be about 0.64 millimeters, so a little bit bigger than a 1/2 millimeter. So still thick enough to do open connectors. So what I like to do with my 22 gauge is I like to make something called an eye pin. And an eye pin is like a head pin. If you watch my basic video, at any time you know what a head pin is, but an eye pin is like a head pin, but it has a loop, an open loop down at the bottom, so I can connect something else to the bottom. So it's great for making dangles and earrings and things like this. 22 gauge is not really heavy enough to make big, open, airy connectors, but it's perfect for a small, open connector like an eye pin. Now we're gonna step it down a little bit more to 24 gauge, which is one of my favorite gauges. I love to do wire wrapping and wrap wire onto things, and so 24 gauge is one of my go-to gauges. It's good for so many different things. In this case, what I've used it for is to make some basic wire loop connectors. But you can see on these connectors that they are closed off because 24 gauge is just about 0.5 millimeters, so a 1/2 millimeter. So you don't want to use it on an open connector because if you did that on a bracelet or on an eye pin, it'd be just really easy for somebody to pull open and your jewelry would break. which would be a problem. So we're not going to do that with 24 gauge, but it's great for these little closed twisted wire connectors. And you can see this is cute just as it is, just with those 3 little colorful beads. You can make a whole necklace like that, and it's so adorable. Now, stepping it down again to 26 gauge. This used to be the thinnest gauge wire I ever worked with. When I first started making jewelry, I didn't even know wire got thinner than 26 gauge, which is about 0.4 millimeter. And that is great for using with small, tiny beads like briolets, like if you see the one I'm wearing right here. Perfect for wrapping that stone. And I have a little example right here. It's a little dagger bead that I've wrapped and then put a small bead on the top. Why do I use 26 gauge wire? Well, usually I use 26 because 24 was too thick for the beads I was working with. And it kind of works the same way 24 gauge wire does, so they're kind of interchangeable. When you get into working with beads, you're gonna find that gemstone beads especially have tiny little holes. And when you're doing a lot of intricate wrapping, you're gonna need to step it down to 26 gauge wire. Now, last one I have here is 28 gauge wire. Really, really fine, tiny wire at 0.3 millimeter. It's great for so many different things. A lot of people do things like wire weaving with 28 gauge wire. I know, that sounds crazy, right? We're not gonna get into that today, but if you're working with tiny little beads and you wanna wire a lot of tiny beads onto a big form, remember that 18 gauge wire I started with right there? There is the 18 gauge wire, made it into a hoop, and I used that 28 gauge wire to wrap all those tiny beads on there. So cool. So that is something that you can do with 28 gauge wire. So you can see that each one of these wires kind of has a specific purpose. Now, I'm not saying you can't do a little bit of this with this and a little bit of this with this. There's some interchangeable things and lots of great things you can do with wire, but these are just some ideas for you to get you started. Thank you so much for joining me here today to learn about all the different gauges of wire and what you can do with them. I had so much fun with you guys. Hey, if you'd like to pick up any of these items, we've got links down below for you to follow. And I'd also love to hear your comments on the types of cool things that you've seen made with wire. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys again next time.